They nicknamed the KTM DUKE the scalpel, but how well can it cut through a dyno? Today we're going to show you all the ways of unlocking hidden horsepower from this beautiful middleweight beast and get this blade razor sharp. Hey everybody, I'm Chris and we are in our state-of-the-art Rottweiler performance dyno here, and beneath me is a brand new KTM 890 DUKE, and boy, this is one of my favorite middleweight contenders right here. These bikes are so much fun, but there is a lot of horsepower that can be unlocked from these from average consumer modifications. And so we've spent a lot of time on the dyno in here, and today we're going to show you what we've learned from this thing and how the different consumer modifications will affect your horsepower. Some of them gain, some of them lose a little bit here and there, but gain you some in a different area. And so we're going to be walking you through step by step exactly what that does. Now for this session, we're going to be showing you exactly how we elicit power out of these different modifications using a DYNOJET power commander. So we're not just going to show you 100% throttle like some other companies might do, because you might be losing horsepower at lower throttle ranges. You're almost never at 100% throttle. You're there for 1% of the time. Honestly, you spend most of your time between 20 and 60% throttle. So we're going to show you exactly how the different modifications affect all the different throttle ranges, and if you indeed actually get a horsepower bump throughout or just in one area or another. We'll also be talking about open loop and closed loop and exactly what that means to you as a consumer as far as being able to gain control of this motor and actually make the fueling modifications for the mods on the bike, like exhaust and intake, things like that. So we're going to show you where the limits are and exactly what options you have to change that, and exactly what the upsides and downsides are as well. We'll also show you exactly what is the best bang for your buck dollar-wise as far as modifying this motorcycle. So you're either going to look at an intake or an exhaust, and maybe your budget has enough for one or the other. So we're going to be going through the dollar per horsepower value of the different modifications so you can decide what you can start on first. And we're also going to show you the ultimate combination where you can extract the most horsepower you can out of this model. Okay, first things first, we're going to show you exactly what air-fuel ratio we're hunting for using a power commander up here on our DYNOJET software screen. So what we have in front of us here are two runs that we've done. One is bone stock and one of them is completely corrected with a Power Commander 5. So the stock run is this blue run here, and so you can see what we're shooting for. How to understand this and what we're looking at is this is your air-fuel ratio, okay? And this is over RPM. So this box here is air-fuel ratio. This box up here is horsepower. Now, what we're seeing here is the air-fuel ratio of stock, and you can see it's basically programmed to hover around 14.7 AFR. Now, 14.7 AFR doesn't exactly make the best horsepower. It's not unsafe, but it's not going to elicit the most horsepower. What does elicit the best horsepower is this red dotted line right here, and what that represents is 13.2 air-fuel ratio. So once you've been able to correct the bike to 13.2 air-fuel ratio by gaining control over it with a power commander, you can then start to elicit more horsepower. So if you look at the relationship between these two charts here, you can see stock, you can see it's 14.7 air-fuel ratio, and then it starts to come out of closed loop right about here, and we'll get into closed loop a little bit later. Now with a corrected map right here, you can see we've gotten our air-fuel ratio closer to this red dotted line, which signifies 13.2. Now this right here, you can see just leaving the same modifications on the bike, the same exhaust, the same intake, simply correcting to 13.2 has elicited a little bit more horsepower right here. So we've gone from 66 to 70.94 horsepower at 5,775 RPM simply by taking the air-fuel ratios and bringing them to more power-inducing 13.2. Now there's also some ignition advance in this as well that the Power Commander is capable of, and we'll also talk about that a little bit later. But this is an example of exactly what we're doing on the dyno to basically correct the air-fuel ratios, gain control, and gain horsepower with these motors. So again, this is stock, this blue line right here, and this red line right here is modified. And so this is an example of what we're doing. So as we move forward in this video, you have a better idea of exactly what we're talking about. Let's talk open and closed loop. to understand mapping, you pretty much have to understand open and closed loop on these bikes. And what they are is basically those narrowband O2s, those things that look like spark plugs in your header, are essentially monitoring your gases in your exhaust system. And bikes, KTM models in particular, from 790 up, actually have the computing power to make adjustments to the maps depending on what's happening in the exhaust. We've found that the bikes below this, the 701, the 700 gas, 690, and bikes below that CC size, they don't use the narrowband O2s to actually make adjustments. They just use them to basically say, hey, I'm within parameters or not within parameters, and then whatever it decides to do with that information. But the 790s and up use those narrowband O2s to basically sniff the gas. It sends a voltage to the ECU. That voltage indicates what the air-fuel ratios are, and it can actually make some adjustments to that. So we did another video where we threw, I think, 30% fuel at idle, and we watched the bike just completely correct it back to 14.7 after it got really rich. And then when we took that fuel out, it went really lean, and then it corrected it back to 14.7 again. So that's what those narrowband O2s are doing, and that's what closed loop uses to monitor the system. Now, closed loop, it's not going to extend all the way to 100% throttle or its max RPM. So typically, the older bikes, the closed loop was smaller, but we're seeing it year after year grow and grow and grow, where certain throttle ranges never come out of closed loop, specifically lower throttle ranges. It used to be they would come out of closed loop maybe past 5,000 RPM. And what open loop is, it's an area of the map that the factories are free to fuel in any way they see fit. Because you can't really run, or you don't really want to run 14.7 air-fuel ratio at 100% throttle at 8,000 RPM. It's not healthy for the motor. So there's a certain RPM in which vehicles and motorcycles can have the freedom to fuel exactly the way they want to and whatever is safe for the motor. But what we're seeing with these bikes is as years progress, we're seeing closed loop last longer and longer, higher into the RPM ranges. We've already shown that on the Adventures. We've already shown that on some other 700cc size models. But right here, we're going to show you exactly where closed loop has been extended to on the 2022 model compared to a 2020. So we've basically got some air-fuel ratios up here on the screen right now, and we're going to start at 100% throttle. So if you look at this, 100% throttle on the 2020 basically came out of closed loop. You can see where it maintains 14.7, and you can tell where they come out of closed loop because they basically start diving down like this into richer areas. So the 2020, they both start to kind of get a little bit richer around 6,000, but it takes the 2022 model about another 2,000 RPM to start coming out of that. So you can say it stays a bit leaner for about 2,000 RPM longer, and you can see up here, though, it's still making a little bit more horsepower, the blue line being the 2022. So it's still making more horsepower. They may have messed with the ignition a little bit. It's hard to say. They may have changed some things in the motor physically, but that's what we're looking at 100% throttle. So let's look at 80 and 60. We're going to cut to the chase. 40% and below between the two models is about the same, but we're going to show you there are some differences between 80 and 60. So we're going to show you 80% throttle on the 2020 and 80% throttle on the 2022. And you can see again, the 2022 stays in closed loop for about 2,000 RPM longer. So each one of these cells right here, these dotted lines represents 1,000 RPM. So it stays in closed loop about 2,000 RPM later and then starts diving down, but it's not really hurting it because it's still making better horsepower than the 2020. So still really not an issue. You get better fuel mileage, and they seem to find that that's okay. And now we're going to look at 60% throttle. And 60%, not a whole lot of difference right here. You can see on the 2020 model, it got a little bit richer, but that could be a nominally. They're fairly close. But the biggest differences between a 2020 and a 2022 is 80 and 100% throttle. They actually extended it another 2,000 RPM, which is kind of interesting. So now that we've covered closed loop and open loop on this model, let's talk about street maps and race maps at Rottweiler Performance. So for the Bosch systems that come on the 790s and 890s and any subsequent model that may have a Bosch system after this video is made, you're basically relegated to only being able to unplug the O2s to get full mapping on these bikes. We can't spoof them with the dongles that we can on the keyhin systems that are on the other models like the 1290 and 1190 as of this date. And typically on those bikes, you would unplug the O2s, you would plug in an O2 optimizer, it would fool the computer into thinking all the conditions were okay, and then you can map over that no problem, no engine light, no nothing. The Bosch systems on these bikes are a lot smarter, unfortunately. So what that means is we've had to basically create street maps and race maps. And what that means is street maps, we don't unplug the narrowband O2s on this. No engine light, you still have cruise control, everything's fine, but we don't have any fueling in the closed loop area of the map because the system would just try to undo it, and they don't run very well because sometimes it runs into a brick wall and your fueling is a little bit off. So what we do is remove all the fuel in closed loop, but we keep the ignition advance, if there is any, across the entire range because the narrowband O2s basically can't sniff ignition advance. So there's still power gains to be had there. Now, if you're looking for that nth degree of power, if you're racing the bike, we have developed what we call race maps. And what race maps are is basically you unplug the O2. It's basically intended as a race map only. You're racing the bike, you don't care about engine lights, you don't care about cruise control. I want the ultimate. So what we do, we unplug the narrowband O2s. It causes an engine light, which conversely causes your cruise control to stop working because KTM doesn't want your cruise control to work if there's any issues with the motor, or it thinks there's any issues with the motor. So you end up with no cruise control and an engine light. The engine light is basically harmless. It's just telling you something's unplugged. But what this does is it allows us to map over the entire range from 0% throttle all the way up to 100% throttle, 0 RPM all the way up to max RPM. So that's what we call race maps. That's the difference between the two. So you just need to decide what you're doing with the bike. Are you willing to live with an engine light and no cruise control? Then you can map the whole thing from top to bottom. If you want to retain those things, you can still use a street map, and there's still good power in that because we've got ignition advance, and then once you get into open loop, we've kind of corrected some things there. So basically that's the long and the short of it, and that's how those maps relate to closed loop and open loop on this bike. Okay, now let's get to the fun stuff. We're going to get into mapping now and what we did with stock. So we're going to start with stock and then modified exhaust and then intake and then both, and we're going to work our way through the progressions of modifying this bike. So let's start out with just remapping this thing bone stock. So we're going to look up here on the WinPep 8 software, and we're going to start comparing some different things. So let's look at 20% and see what we did with the fuel here. So here's 20%. Got a little bit of horsepower here at 20% throttle. You can see we took stock. This blue line right here is stock, and we dropped that down a little bit, got this a bit richer, and you can see it elicited a little bit of horsepower here. So we'll go to 40% and see where that got us. So here's 40% remapped, and here's 40% stock. So you can, again, you can see the differences right here. So a little bit of horsepower, some gains throughout. Basically at 40% throttle, you know, we're looking at 1.5 horsepower, that sort of thing. Not too bad. A little bit of horsepower here, 5,353 RPM. And then you can see the air-fuel ratios got a little bit better as well. So let's start getting into the higher throttle openings. So we're going to go to 60% here. You can see we're still making a little bit of power here. Still looks pretty good. If we put it on single graph, it you know, you can see the gains a little bit better. It's not so squished. But you can see right here, they're around 6,000 RPM. We're looking at a little bit of horsepower. Now, see this little dip right here? We're going to talk about this later. This is created by the stock catalytic converter. So it kind of hurts this portion of the power range, and this is right exactly where you cruise the bike when you're on the throttle, on the freeway. This is 5,000 RPM, so that's not the greatest thing in the world right there. So we're going to show you how to fix that a little bit. And so now let's look at 80% throttle. Stock 80% throttle, you can see 14.7 AFR. You can see it start to come out of closed loop right there and enter into open loop. Now this is a race map, so we basically were able to map it across the board, and you can see there's, you know, some decent horsepower, a couple, you know, 2.5 horsepower, 2 3/4 horsepower throughout. You know, this is right about where you ride the bike, right in here. So not too bad. And now let's look at 100%. This is remapped, and this is stock. So again, you know, some pretty decent gains. You look right here, right around where you ride it. That's a healthy 4 horsepower. Not too bad right there. That's to the tire. You can see we've mapped it to 13.2 or close to it pretty much across the board. And then here's stock, and it comes out of closed loop right around 6,000. So pretty good gains across the board, just mapping stock, but we're going to keep going, and we're going to show you what further modifications to this bike with mapping will do. Okay, we got the boring stock stuff out of the way. Let's start with the modifications. Exhaust systems, more specifically, decatting. A lot of Duke owners like to decat these bikes because they make a great sound. they drop about 4.5 pounds in weight and decrease engine temperature a little bit. But what does that translate to in terms of your power curve? Well, there's a lot of people who think that decatting causes problems, mainly because they've read some nefarious things online, unfortunately. But the truth of the matter is, decatting is absolutely harmless. What does it do? It basically makes your engine think that the exhaust is longer. So essentially what happens through the exhaust system is there is pulses that travel back and forth that help the tuning of the motor, that basically dictate where in the motor is going to make power. So diameters and lengths make a big difference in tuning as far as exhaust is concerned. When you have a catalytic converter, it's basically, on this bike, it's a catalytic converter and a pre-muffler. So essentially the exhaust comes down and dumps into that chamber, and as soon as it does, all the tuning is gone. It stops. And so anything out the back end from there on really doesn't matter and doesn't have much effect. So the engine basically thinks that the exhaust system is very short. So KTM essentially, what they'll do is they'll go in and say, okay, what are we forced to put on these motorcycles? Well, that's a catalytic converter. So what they'll do is they'll adjust items in and around the engine like velocity stack, size, length, throttle body diameters, and things like this, valve diameters, to work in concert with what they have to run on this motorcycle. So when you remove that item, it throws things a little bit out of whack. Now in this case, it's not really a bad thing. It just, again, makes the motor think that the exhaust is a bit longer. And so the reversions and the pulses are coming back at different RPMs and just adjusting your power band a little bit. So there's really harmless. If you changed a lot of the other pieces on the engine to work in concert with a longer exhaust, it would probably work even better. But for this purpose, it's fine. So what we're going to do is show you on the video right here exactly what happens when you switch to a DECAT exhaust. So this is an open muffler and DECAT stock intake. And we're going to show you exactly how it reshapes your power band. Now, you gain some in some very important areas, and you do lose some in some other areas. And so we're going to explain that to you now, starting with 20% throttle. So we're going to click on 20% throttle on the decatted remapped version right here. So we have this nice curve. And remember how we had this kind of dip in the power curve that we were showing you before. So what's nice about this is at 20% throttle, we're looking at a pretty much a net gain right here. Really no negative effects at 20. So let's look at 40. Now we start seeing that awful dip that I pointed out before, and the decatting basically just smoothing that out. So we have a nice smooth arc. But what have we seen? We've seen a slight loss down low here, a really healthy gain here. So at 40% throttle and right about where you ride it, you know, we've gained over 3 horsepower right here. And, you know, basically negligible in this area. You know, we've got a slight loss right here, but then a little bit gain over here. So, but most importantly, we've got this nice fat pocket right here filled in with a beautiful curve at 40% throttle. So very happy with that. Let's look at 60. 60% throttle, we're seeing similar things. It's basically just growing higher in the throttle ranges and RPM ranges. So we see a nice net gain right here where you ride it. Remember, you're cruising around 5,000 RPM. This is where you spend most of your time. And then, you know, the rest of it is negligible. You do lose a little bit way on top, and part of that reason is because, again, you've lengthened the exhaust. The engine thinks that the exhaust is much longer now. Reversions and pulses are happening at different rates, and there's a little bit net loss on top. You can recover that with possibly shorter velocity stacks or larger ones, things like this. But for the most part, I'm liking what I'm seeing here. We also have a loss in exhaust temperature, which translates into a loss in temperature for the motor. We also have an awesome sound, and we have a very simplified motorcycle. And it also kind of gets that roasting cherry bomb out from the center of the bike. And so now let's look at 80% throttle. And we're going to start seeing similar trends even at 80% throttle right here. So again, we have this kind of, you know, dull pocket right here. It tends to be extended a bit longer here. And again, with a slight loss on top, not much. So we're seeing there's a good healthy 5.5 horsepower right here. That is nothing to sneeze at. And on the very top, where you're rarely at, you know, we're looking at a little less than a 3 horsepower loss, maybe 2.5 there. So not too bad, worthwhile trade in my opinion. And then let's look at 100% throttle. 100% throttle, we're seeing the same thing. Pretty much net right here from the bottom. We still have our nice kind of big gains right here. and then we're seeing a slight loss on top. So basically with decatting, you can see what's happening. We've done this stock without doing any mapping whatsoever, and it really doesn't throw off the fueling all that much. It does mess with it here and there, but these things self-tune pretty well, and we haven't seen negative effects from that. There's been lots of our customers that have done this without any tuning, but the added tuning will get you those net gains right there. And they look pretty good to me. So it's up to you to decide whether you want to decat or not. And basically seeing this evidence, you're seeing very similar things repeated over the different throttle ranges. So that should set your mind at ease at exactly what's going to happen when you just decat one of these bikes. Okay, let's have a quick discussion about ignition timing and what that can mean to you through a Power Commander unit. Now, ignition timing basically gives us the ability to advance the spark a little bit, which is known for making power. Now, you don't want to go too far because you can actually create knocking or pinging in your engine, which can do some damage. So typically stock, they're fairly on the conservative side. And with a Power Commander, we're actually able to advance that a bit. To date, we really haven't had much issue with it. The bottom line is you can advance a motor until it stops liking it. So you'll see increases in horsepower and increases as you advance the ignition, then it stops liking it, then it starts going the other way if you go too far, and then we'll back it up a little bit further to be conservative. We do use knock sensors when we're building these maps as well to kind of basically see if there's any knocking or pinging in the engine. They're very sensitive devices that listen to the motor. But basically advanced ignition can offer the user the advantage of a lot of horsepower in these bikes. Now, the advantage of that is they actually work really well in street maps that don't have a lot of fuel in them. So we're actually giving some spark advance. And this is also a really good time to introduce map switches, which work with Power Commander. So a map switch basically is a very simple device. It's just an open and closed switch that gives you the ability to run dual maps. And so you can actually run the same map, one with advanced ignition and then one with no or moderate ignition. And that way you can switch back and forth depending on if you feel the gas you have in your bike is a good enough grade. Now, obviously, you'd want to run this with a higher octane fuel. But if you end up with a lower octane fuel, you can just switch to the other map and Bob's your uncle. It's pretty much done. Map switches aren't very expensive, and you can add one to your kit and get dual maps, and it's a pretty nice deal. And the other thing that I should mention is that the coils in these bikes have ionic knock sensors, so if there's any excessive knocking, they actually will pull stock timing and try and save your motor. You'll basically feel a reduction in horsepower. So that's how you know that they've detected any knocking or pinging. But typically, we put a lot of maps out there with some pretty advanced ignition, and a lot of our customers are very happy with them. But again, we would probably suggest a map switch with that so you can switch back to something else and not be stuck with whatever map that is. Now, what we're going to do right now is we're going to look at the exact same map, the exact same configuration, which is basically a stock intake with a DECAT, which is what we just showed you in the last section. But we're going to show you one with ignition and one without at 100% throttle. So let's go up here to the screen and let's look at this run at 100% throttle right here. And this is no ignition right here. And this is with ignition advanced. Now, this is the exact same setup and the exact same fueling map, just with added ignition. And you can see past 5,000 RPM and even a little bit of a pocket at 4, it really starts to separate itself from no ignition at all. So this basically is a nice way of showing that street maps are really worthwhile if you want to retain your cruise control and all that. And advanced ignition can be a really good thing. Okay, so we did stock intake with an aftermarket exhaust. Now we're going to flip that on its head, and we're going to do a Rottweiler Performance full intake system and a stock exhaust, which is a catalytic converter and the stock muffler. So what we're going to do is show you up here on the screen exactly what happens if, hypothetically, you had a completely stock bike that was macked by a Power Commander, and then you just threw on the intake. So if you look at this red line right here, this is basically what happens when you just throw on an intake and keep the map that is intended for just stock. And it creates a slightly leaner pocket right here. Well, if you look right here, this is bone stock right here. So it's still richer than that. So you're still in a really good position, but it's thrown that map off a little bit. So that's a great example to show you guys exactly why we have so many different maps available. So if you have this setup where you have a Rottweiler intake and a stock exhaust, then you can just switch to that map and you'll have a great map that's already set up and ready to go for that configuration. So the next thing we're going to show you is we're going to close these two and we're going to start comparing what a Rottweiler Performance intake and stock exhaust with a Power Commander map how that compares to a baseline. So we're going to start at 20% throttle right here. So this is with the Rottweiler intake remapped, and 20% throttle stock right here. So huge gains right here. This is just 20% throttle. So we're looking at 1.25 horsepower. Not too bad for 20% throttle across the board. So that's a really healthy line right here. We're very pleased with that. So let's move on to 40% throttle. So this is 40% with a Rottweiler intake, power commander, and a stock exhaust versus 40% throttle stock. So you can see there's still a nice little net gain right here. We've got a couple horsepower here, more than a couple, and all the way across the board. So not too bad with that. This is 60 with a Rottweiler intake, stock exhaust, and this is 60 stock. So you can see we're starting to get a larger and larger disparity here. We're looking at over 4 horsepower. This is over 4.5 horsepower right where you ride it. This is the area where you ride it. And then, you know, continuing horsepower on up. You know, we're looking at, you know, a couple horsepower, 2.5 horsepower there, pretty much all the way through. And you can see we've got this really nice 13.2 line right here versus the very lean 14.7 stock. Now let's look at 80% throttle. Now we're cooking with grease here. So we're looking at, gosh, 6.5 horsepower right here, over 6.5 horsepower, right about where you ride it. Same thing here, pretty much all the way through. I mean, the proof is right here. Again, this is mapped with a Rottweiler performance intake and stock exhaust, and this is stock right here. So let's check out 100% throttle and see what we got with that. So again, really nice fueling right here with the power commander. We're looking at 6 horsepower right there. You know, these are looking pretty healthy. That's close to that's about 9 horsepower right there. So 9 horsepower just between those two. I'm on a budget. I can only afford one or the other. A power commander with an exhaust system or a power commander with a Rottweiler intake system. Which one do I get if I'm searching for the best bang for my buck in terms of horsepower gains? Well, up here on the screen, we've got 3 dyno runs here. We've got blue is bone stock, green is mapped with an exhaust system and a DECAT, and red is mapped with a Rottweiler intake system only. So you can already see there's a huge gain with a Rottweiler intake system there. Now there's later on, right after this actually, we're going to show you what it's going to do with an intake system and a DECAT. And that's pretty much our ultimate map. But if you can only afford one or the other, we're showing you exactly what you're going to get out of either one right here. So let's look at the dollar per horsepower figure. So if you're looking at an exhaust system, the biggest disparity we could find is right around 5,000 RPM, which was about 6 horsepower gain, which is not bad. Well, a DECAT and a titanium muffler and a power commander typically cost around $1,500. So divided by 6, you're roughly $250 per horsepower to gain power. When you're looking at a Rottweiler intake system and a power commander, the biggest disparity we could find is right about here, which is about 10.5 horsepower at about 5,900 RPM. A Pro version Rottweiler intake system and a power commander is roughly $880. Divided by 10.5, you're looking at roughly $84 per horsepower. So compared against $250 per horsepower, the Rottweiler intake system is probably the best place to start in terms of power. Now, if you're looking for sound or lightweight or that sort of thing, the Rottweiler intake system actually loses a little bit of weight, but not as much as a DECAT. That's about 4.5 pounds. So if you're looking for sound and weight, definitely start with the exhaust first, and you can add the intake later. But if you're searching for raw horsepower for your dollar, the Rottweiler intake systems are really tough to beat. Okay, moving along, we're going to show you exactly what all these modifications do together. So we've got a Rottweiler intake system, a DECAT system, an open muffler, and a power commander mapped. Now, up on the screen here, we've got 20, 40, and 60% already loaded together. So you can kind of see the similarities in the power curves of stock versus a full modification mapped. So you can see right here at 20%, you know, we have this kind of little gap right here. It's kind of hard to measure horsepower that low, but as we get up into 40%, remember this big hole right here that the stock catalytic converter caused? Well, you can see with the Rottweiler intake system, we're just sailing over that, and the DECAT system, and we're basically above stock horsepower pretty much the entire way with no loss. Small disparities here and there, but really nothing to to be too concerned about. And then up at 60% throttle, we start to see some pretty big gaps, most noticeably right about here, where we're looking at 7 horsepower just at 5,000 RPM. Again, this is all where you ride the bike. You're pretty much exist in this RPM range right here. So filling in this gap is really, really impressive with all these mods. And so basically this one continues on the way up. So now we're going to look at 80% throttle, and we're going to start to see some larger and larger disparities as we make more and more horsepower. So 80%, really good gap right here. We're looking at, you know, this is a solid, you know, 9 horsepower right here. This is a very happy map right here, and tiny little loss right here, but there's no way I'd keep this in lieu of all that right there. So let's get up into 100% throttle right here, and we're looking at a solid 10 horsepower right where you cruise the bike. And this pretty much extends all the way up throughout. So Rottweiler intake system, DECAT, open muffler, mapped with a Rottweiler performance map is a really impressive combination right here, especially for 100% throttle. Okay, now let's talk about what we call our max horsepower maps. And our max horsepower maps are basically diminishing returns. And what that means is we take a 13.2 map, which is basically, most tuners would stop at 13.2. They would shoot for that and say, here's your bike, and send you on your way if they were making one map. Because we're making maps for thousands of people, we actually go in and spend the extra time to make each one of our maps as perfect as it can be. But there's one step we can take it further depending on the use of the map. So we have what's called our max horsepower maps that we've made for this bike right here. And what that means is we've gone into every corner of this map and we've played with the fuel. Now 13.2 is a basic target, but that is not a law. It's not exactly, it's your rule of thumb, but it's not a law. And so sometimes there's enrichments or enleanments in different places in the map where the bike actually likes it and responds to it. The problem is sometimes you're using 10% more fuel for about 2% more horsepower. So that's why we call them diminishing returns. So we really only recommend these types of maps if A, you're running a map switch and you just want to run it for a short period of time, but you're going to be using a lot more fuel than with another map to get a tiny bit of probably unnoticeable horsepower, but it is there. Or B, you're racing this thing and fuel mileage is not a concern. You want to beat the competition and you want the most horsepower you can get. So we go through when we find little bits and pieces that the bike really likes all over the place, and then we start piecing those together to form what we call, again, our max horsepower map. So up on the screen here, I'm going to show you 2 comparisons. The previous map we just showed at 13.2, which is the Rottweiler intake system and a full DECAT and open muffler, mapped to 13.2 AFR. Then I'm going to show you our ultimate map and the gains we got from that. Now again, you might be using quite a bit more fuel, that sort of thing. It's really going to drop your mileage, but this is the no holds barred map for max horsepower right here. So we're going to bring up 20% throttle first from the max horsepower map, and that's right here, and then right there. So we're looking at, I know it looks like a lot, but this is really a 20% horsepower. So, you know, we've got horsepower and a half right here. That's nothing to complain about at 20%. But we've played with the fueling. We saw what it likes, and we've gotten that much more over our previously best map, which is the 13.2, pretty much, you know, our average map. So if it doesn't say max horsepower, it's that map. So let's look at 40% throttle right here. And some areas we just couldn't find anything at all. We found a little bit here. You know, we've gotten a little bit better curve. Now, we haven't touched the ignition at all. This is pure fuel. So we've got a little bit at 40. Let's check out 60. 60% throttle, we pretty much didn't find anything at all. A tiny bit right up here. Okay, sure, we've got it, but not a ton. But 80 and 100% is where we start seeing some pretty good returns from this. So here is our max horsepower map, and this is our previous map right here. So right here we're looking at, gosh, there's about 2.5 horsepower right here. That's not too bad. And again, this is just right above where you pretty much cruise it, or this is where you're just starting to get on the gas when you're accelerating. So we'll take it. This is a pretty good map right here. And now let's look at 100% throttle from our max horsepower map. And again, we have a similar gap, it's even increased a little bit here. So we're looking at a solid 3.2 horsepower right around here. So we're pretty happy with that. So again, these maps are diminishing returns, using a lot more fuel, or sometimes less fuel actually, to get these gains, but they're available, and that's what they do. All right, this is undoubtedly the part of the video you've probably all been waiting for, and that is a stacking of all the graduations of the modifications. And so up on our screen here, we're showing nothing but 100% throttle, so we can show you the disparities between each one, and you can decide for yourself where you want to be according to your budget or your modification schedule. So first we're starting with this brown line here, and that's basically stock. Up from there, we've got stock that's remapped with a power commander. Moving from there, we've got stock intake, DECAT exhaust, open muffler with a power commander. And you can see there's a little bit of a loss on top right here that we spoke about before, but a big gain in the middle here when compared to just mapped stock. So it gets rid of that nice hump below where you ride the bike, but there's a little bit of a cost. So we're going to start to regain that back with further modifications. So the next is the Rottweiler intake with stock exhaust. So that's a pretty healthy curve right there. The stock exhaust is going to kind of maintain this upper part, but there's a little bit of a loss here when you're running the catalytic converter. So you're going to have to decide where you're running the bike. Now, I highly doubt if you're running a fast track that you're going to put the stock exhaust back on. So I have a feeling most people are just going to deal with a DECAT exhaust if they're racing their bikes and you know, deal with the slight loss in horsepower on the top, but it's really, it's not much of a debate in my opinion. Moving forward, we've got the Rottweiler intake system with a DECAT exhaust mapped at 13.2. So you can see the difference between those two. There's a little bit of a loss right there, but not too bad. I'll take that healthy mid-range any day, faster out of the corners and that sort of thing. And then moving forward, and finally, we've got our max horsepower map. So that's pretty much unbeatable right there. That's a Rottweiler intake system, a DECAT exhaust, an open muffler, a power commander, and our max horsepower map. And that honestly is your best combination. That's pretty much throwing everything at it. And so we're very satisfied with that. But you can run a map switch and run these two, and you can kind of go back and forth, and you can pretty much do that between any two maps. So that's a good way to go. All right, everybody, I hope this video has been educational, showing you all the different ways that we're able to extract horsepower from this awesome model. We spent a lot of time in the dyno building these maps and subsequently building notes for this video so we can help you guys understand exactly what happens when you modify this bike and where the power curves kind of move around depending on what you do. And so at the end, we've got about 11 horsepower to the tire out of this bike with a Rottweiler intake and a DECAT exhaust, open muffler, power commander. And that's pretty good for a car. And imagine what that would cost you on a Formula One car, quite frankly, millions. So not a bad bang for your buck on this bike. So if this has been helpful and educational, please like and subscribe below, and we're happy to answer the comments as well. We're excited when those come in, and let us know whatever questions you guys have. So thanks again for watching this video. We're gonna make more of these, so keep an eye out, and we'll see you in the next one.